Welcome to another Ocean Ideas Talk, brought to you by ocean lovers.
Now to our first session of the day, in which we are talking about seafood and whether it's possible to eat seafood with a conscience. Please would you join me in welcoming Matt Goddard and Dr. Adrain Gutteridge. Matt Goddard has a vision of a future for food which has ignited an unparalleled drive and focus. He believes that with advances in technology, business models, and a focus on sustainability, we can create a more efficient and sustainable food system. Hopefully that wasn't everything you were going to say today in your introduction. And Dr. Adrain Gutteridge is an expert shark biologist, MSc Fisheries Assessment Manager, and a member of the IUCN Shark Specialist Group. Last Christmas, he was part of leading the charge for sustainable seafood choices by supporting our local fishmongers, fisheries and retailers championing sustainability in seafood choices with standards meeting the MSC Blue Fish tick. Would you join me in welcoming Matt and Adrain? I think firstly, I'm not going to apologise for another mammal because we have evened out the gender diversity very well throughout the day. But I'd love to hear a little bit more about what you do, about what AquaCultr does, about your work with MSC, to explore this eating seafood with a conscience part. Matt, we'll start with you and then go to Adrain.
Sure, yeah, thanks Robin, and thanks for having me here today. So AquaCultr Group we're an 18-month-old startup. We're focused on commercialising a technology that we believe is the future of seafood, which is recirculating aquaculture system tech, or RAS systems as they're known. Our journey started probably about 2.5 years ago when I had a bit of a deep experience where I had a realisation that much of our food system woes are as a result of our disconnection to food. And if we're ever to solve the root cause of our challenges within the food system, it's to somehow get at this connection piece. So that started a journey for me from originally an environmental scientist and co-founder of a software company before this, and delved into the journey of finding a way to sustainably produce seafood. So the system, or the platform that we believe is the future is this recirculating aquaculture system technology, which is not necessarily a new technology. It's still very much an emerging platform. And the idea is that all the water continually recirculates within a system. Seafood can be grown on a fairly small land footprint with a very small water footprint and indoors in controlled environments. So it's a form of intensive farming, very different to traditional fish farming, and it allows us to completely isolate the fish and the seafood from nature, and therefore we have very little impact on the environment. There's no disease transmission between farmed fish and wild fish, and therefore no requirement for antibiotics and fish vaccines and harsh chemicals in the process. So aquaculture as a industry is quite a new industry when in the grand scheme of things. It's 40, 50 years old max, globally. And it's going through its evolutions, and the traditional forms of fish farming are what's known as sea cage farming, which is what's done in Tasmania with the salmon farms, and pond-based farming, which is largely done in the North Queensland and Northern Territory with barramundi, and they do a little bit of Murray cod farming in that way as well in the Riverina. These forms of fish farming currently have their pretty strong headwinds, and that's getting stronger. Environmental policy, social licence to operate, regulations that are coming into that space. I've got a belief that those forms of fish farming are expiring, and whether it's 5 years or 10 years, there's definitely expiry date on that form of farming. Traditional wild catch seafood quotas are reducing. In a large part, fisheries are under a lot of pressure from a global population, but 3 billion people rely on seafood as their primary source of protein, and there's a growing demand for seafood as well. So for us, we feel like there's an amazing opportunity to carve a sustainable path and evolve the way that seafood is done, and really seafood is quite possibly the last frontier for farming. We farm our beef and our lamb and our chicken and our wheat and our rice and broccoli, but we still take our seafood from the wild at an industrial scale. So we're on that frontier trying to carve a new path. So, yeah.
Almost immediately have a million questions, but we might let Adrian get a word in edgeways. Tell us a bit about what you do and about how things are changing.
Yeah, no worries. So I'm Adrain Gutteridge. Nice to meet you all. So I work for the Marine Stewardship Council. We're a global non-for-profit that focuses on wild capture fisheries, not aquaculture. We're a third-party scheme, really, so that fisheries around the world can choose voluntarily to go through the MSC program and sort of demonstrate their sustainability credentials by meeting our requirements for what we consider a sustainable wild capture fishery. In that process, there's also a very strong chain of custody that pretty much can trace the seafood from the boat to the consumer. And so the whole program is based around, at the end of it, whoever gets MSC certified, they can carry the MSC blue fish tick logo. And so that kind of empowers consumers to purchase that product, buying from a sustainable fishery. That encourages more fisheries to get certified, and we can all be warm and fuzzy inside. The process is third party in that the MSC doesn't do the certification. It's the independent assessors who are basically fisheries experts looking at that fishery and determining whether it meets our criteria. In terms of sustainability, our criteria rely on three main things. The first is that your target stock, so when a fishery goes out targeting whatever they want to sell, so it could be prawns, for example, that target stock is healthy and the science underwriting that population assessment is rigorous. Also that your bycatch, so the things that you don't intend to target, so other things in your fishery that are incidentally caught, you're not impacting those populations such that they're declining, and that includes the habitats that those animals rely on. And the third is that you've got strong management in place, good science, the best information available to inform those other parts of your fishery. I've been working at MSC for 10 years. My focus is primarily tuna fisheries, so the longline fleets off Australia, for example, the ones in the Western Central Pacific. As Robin mentioned, my background was shark research about 10 or 15 years ago up in Hervey Bay near K'gari, Fraser Island. That's kind of how I landed in tuna, because tuna fisheries interact with lots of sharks. And so basically, summary of our program is that the end result is if seafood products carry the MSC blue fish tick, that's what we consider to be a consumer's sort of choice to purchase, and that encourages more fisheries to get certified, which then changes the global fisheries market, so to speak.
So you talked about the healthiness of the stock and the bycatch and the management. If I run a fishery, what do I have to do differently? Like, what do I have to do to actually call myself sustainable?
Yeah, well, as far as the MSC is concerned, you'd have to meet our requirements for, like I said, sustainability criteria. The difference between an MSC certified fishery and, I guess, in general, a sustainable fishery versus one that's probably not, there's a couple of key characteristics. The first is that the science that's involved in understanding the populations that you're fishing, that has to be essentially best practice. So we benchmark all our criteria against what we consider global best practice. So as a global best practice, you need to understand the population you're fishing, which comes from a stock assessment that fisheries scientists run. You then have to, based off that, you run what's called a harvest strategy or harvest control rules. Those are essentially if and when rules. So you know that if your target stock changes over time, you know at what point you need to kick management in order to reduce that fishing pressure on that stock or continue going. So you need to have both adaptability and responsiveness in that. And then the key is to understand your broader impact. So the big difference between a fishery that's probably outside the MSC program and inside the program or certified is their information that they need to show all that. So you really need to focus and put a big effort into like getting a broad spectrum of information from what you're targeting, the bycatch, the habitat interactions you're having, understanding all those populations and understanding the impact that fishery has, and demonstrating through science stock assessments that what that fishery is taking out of the water isn't driving that population to a point where it can't be there, pretty much infinitum.
I've got lots of questions, by the way. I will keep going, but I'm going to turn to the audience because I'd love to hear some of your questions for Matt and Adrian in just a moment. Matt, you were talking about recirculating aquaculture systems, and you gave the example of beef and chicken and broccoli and all these things. Can you scale these up? I mean, to the same sort of extent as those big industries that you mentioned. Can this be scaled up in the same way?
Yes, 100%. That's our mission at the moment. We believe that we've got a technology platform that we can scale. Recirculating aquaculture systems globally have been sort of touted as the future of aquaculture for a number of years now. They've yet to be proven commercially viable. Some of the big companies that are looking at this space out of Europe and the US are almost exclusively focused on very, very large centralised plants, so to speak, 3, 4, 5,000 tonnes per annum out of one site. Where we believe that the future of RAS is in a distributed production manner, in a similar way to, say, poultry farming, and how that has been able to scale. I see a pending crunch, not only for seafood but for protein in general in the coming decade, and there's a tsunami of environmental policy regulation that's coming into agriculture as a general industry, and the subsequent pressure that's going to have is forcing those industries to evolve, and that's what we're preparing for, and ultimately we're focused on building out a system that can thrive in that future regulatory world and policy world, which is inherently sustainable and can withstand those changes and those shifts in policy. So the poultry industry done it quite well in terms of scaling infrastructure, and that industry's had to evolve again with RSPCA standards and growing an industry that is more acceptable with the times, and that has provided, I guess, an example of how infrastructure can be scaled in this distributed way. So around the country there's hundreds, and when you include the egg industry as well, thousands of poultry farms in independently owned infrastructure, labour, farming communities around those, and that model has worked really well as an agricultural template. So our systems are able to plug into that model and be land-based, completely removed from the oceans and independent of the environment. So, yeah.
So a question before I come to the audience, and I guess I'll ask a similar question to each of you. How would I know if something that I was buying or eating or in a restaurant was the product of more sustainable practices from your perspective?
Seafood as a whole is very difficult to tell. It's one of the hardest industries to trace food across the supply chain. In fact, 70% of Australia's seafood is actually imported, and many people don't realise that, including barramundi, which is about 60% of the country's barramundi is imported. And most consumers, because barramundi is an indigenous word to Australia, most consumers believe that if they're buying barramundi, they're buying an Australian product. As I said, 60% of it's grown in Southeast Asia, the Philippines, Vietnam, Thailand, Sri Lanka, and there's somewhat questionable practices in those countries as well. And in Southeast Asia, barramundi is known as Asian sea bass, so it's sort of rebadged coming into Australia. So very hard, even fish that's caught in Australian waters can be, a lot of it is processed and value added in China, places like China and Southeast Asia, for the Australian consumer market. So it's very difficult to tell. We're building a brand around what we're doing and trying to communicate this story. A big part of the journey we have to take consumers on over the next 5 to 10 years is there is still a mindset of preference of wild seafood over farm seafood, and the aquaculture industry as a whole has got a lot of work to do there with transparency and clearly demonstrating that fish coming from the aquaculture space are as good, if not better, than wild-caught seafood and as nutritious. So,
Gotcha. Adrian, I almost know the answer to this one, but if I'm buying something in a can in the shop, in a restaurant, how would I know that this is sustainable seafood?
Yeah, well, from the MSC's perspective, it's got the MSC blue fish tick on it, so that's been through our program. And just picking up on something Matt was talking about in terms of substitution and issues in the supply chain for seafood, that's actually one of the strengths of the MSC program, as I mentioned in my sort of early ramblings, was that if you're MSC certified, you need to be able to trace your product from the boat to your point of sale. And so anyone who handles that seafood in the supply chain has to be accredited to hold MSC seafood. And we also run DNA testing in our supply chain for that. And it's demonstrated about 99% of testing that we've done has demonstrated that what they're selling is the actual thing. But yeah, substitution and illegal fishing into the fishing supply chain is a massive issue. I'd say the biggest one to do for consumers, supermarkets, MSC, eco-label, but you can just asking the restaurant, asking who you're buying from, what they're actually giving you. And if they can't tell you that, or they don't give the answer that you want, you don't have to buy it. It's the old adage that the most powerful conservation tool you have as a human is your wallet. And so if you're making informed choices using your own money, that's the biggest message you can send to brands, corporations, all that kind of stuff. From our perspective, it's not, obviously nothing's perfect, but the supply chain underwriting MSC we think is very strong.
I've been a supply chain nerd for the last decade, and it still fascinates me how little we ask about where our stuff comes from, whether it's seafood or timber or products. I saw Marina's hand go straight up there. Questions from the audience. Marina, go first, please.
Do you want a mic?
Thank you. Yeah, hi. Ooh, wow, that's loud. You talk about, this whole talk is about having a conscience with your food. I don't understand, how do you square that when we know fish are completely sentient beings? They feel pain. They're in factory farmed fish. They're kept in very small spaces. They cannot do their normal lifestyle. It's the same with factory farmed chickens, which is only scalable because we're cramming them into smaller and smaller spaces. Same in the egg industry. And, as far as conscience, male chicks are shredded alive, everyone, in the egg industry because they're useless to the egg industry. So how do you square that, having a conscience, while you're basically torturing and murdering fish that feel pain and cannot live normal lives? And my other question is about, for the marine stewardship. Okay.
I assume that question's for me. Look, I think if whether we consume animal protein or not is, for me, a completely separate conversation. Well, we're talking about seafood.
No, we're talking about sentience.
Okay, well, look, my perspective is there's 9 billion people on the planet that need to be fed, and I can assure you that if there's 9 billion people that are hungry, you can forget the environmental consequences of what's going to happen when that happens. And you can see that in parts of Africa when almost entire countries have been decimated to keep people alive. Farming is the root of all of our food systems. Every piece of food that comes into our mouths largely has been farmed, other than wild-caught seafood. And for me, aquaculture is not perfect. As I said earlier, it's a new industry, and it's going through an evolution right now. And where we are in 10 years will be different to where we are now, and where we are in 50 years will be different to where we are now. And then just with respect to the animals, we have a deep respect for the fish that we farm, and they are kept in a controlled environment, which is optimum for their growth and their survival. So, aquaculture as a farming practice at its root is about stress management, and you can't farm a fish under stress. It's impossible. So, for it to be successful, you need to maintain a stress-free environment. So.
And Adrian, any comment on the conscience, ethical side of things as well, or the sentience part, as Marina said?
No, I think Matt covered it pretty well. I'd just say, like, from my perspective, it's a similar thing for food security and, demand for protein around the world. You can bring that sentience argument in, but as far as being able to feed people, it's an individual's choice if they want to make that decision. But our perspective is sustainability of that resource.
We have somebody with a microphone. We do have someone. There's a question just here. We will come back to you, Marina. Just there.
Hi. My question is more about the consumer and how historically, like, the market adapts to the consumer's needs. What about the consumer adapting to the environmental needs? So we as humans are always looking for new ways to solve these problems. But what about we just say no to the public and see, this is what the ocean can give us. We can, like, farm till this point, and you could get this amount of protein from the ocean weekly. That's it. Or, where I'm going? And
so I understand the point. What's the question in that?
my question is, why keep trying to, like, make things more efficiently, more like to get advantage of everything? It's more an ethical question. Like, what about just saying no to the public and say, look for other ways to find protein? Because the ocean is getting to a tipping point where there might be no coming back. That's kind of the question.
Well, I agree with you that the ocean's getting to a tipping point, and part of our mission is to bring seafood production onto land. So all of our systems are land-based, removed from the environment and removed from the ocean, you've got places like Tasmania where 70% of the state now are against the salmon farming industry in that state, and that's that consumer saying, no more. That we can see the impact that this form of farming is having on the environment, and I think there is a mindset that the ocean is this massive place. It covers a huge area of the world, and that's true. But the ocean works in currents, and life is not prevalent throughout the whole ocean. And of course, when you have a concentrated farming environment like they do in Tasmania or Chile or Norway, the waste stream from those farms end up being quite concentrated in sensitive coastal environments. So for me, there is a solution there, is to bring that farming on land in a sustainable way, and and reduce the impact on the oceans and the environment. And then in terms of saying no to just continuing to consume seafood, it comes back to what Adrian said. I think the consumer can drive that if they don't have a choice. And there are more choices coming on. There's insect farms and there's all sorts of other things coming in. Ultimately, people need food, and the industry will always respond to the market. And for me, there is a growing demand for seafood because it's people moving away from red meat. Seafood's seen as a fairly nutritious, low impact protein, and that demand is growing. And I hope that sort of addresses some of what you said.
There's a couple of questions here, just out of interest, and I'm not trying to prove any point. How many people in the room have eaten red meat in the last 12 months? And how many people in the room have eaten fish in the last 12 months? So I think, again, not trying to prove anything, but I think there is very much a need to be looking at how we make these provisions in a more sustainable manner, and how we can reduce the impact that we see. Did you want to make a point? There's a question.
Yeah, just one final thing about the demand for seafood. So saying no, you can't eat seafood anymore. Like globally, like 3 billion people rely on their protein from the ocean, and the main source of that is fishing. So if you're in a place where that is your main, dietary need, input of protein, like Pacific Islands, for example, if they run out of fish and there's no ability to feed that demand, quite literally, then there's going to be huge, nutritional hunger problems around the world for sure. And in fact, maintaining the health of the ocean and maintaining food supply is one of the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. They've put forward as, the next kind of 20, 25 years kind of thing. So it's massive. It has to be adaptive. It has to push to other, more sustainable means for sure.
There's a question just here.
Yeah, I was just interested to know how many of these farms exist in Australia at the moment, and how big a piece of land would you need to have a farm, and in terms of what it can produce, or where we're at the moment in Australia, how much seafood can we produce for them right now, in context of how much demand there is in Australia?
Yeah, sure.
Good question.
So we're focused on farming barramundi for a number of reasons, and traditionally barramundi is grown in pond-based systems. There is one ocean sea cage farm in Australia off the coast of West Australia, but largely almost all the barramundi is farmed in pond-based systems that are right on the coast or part of an estuary system where water will come in, flow through the farms and back out. The recirculating aquaculture system farms, there is one in South Australia which is what's called a flow-through system, so it's indoor and contained, but there's no recirculation of the water, so it uses a massive volume of warm groundwater. There's another farm in Victoria which has been around for a while, and it's been successfully producing fish in this way, albeit probably uncommercially. And we've got a site up at Port Stephens where that happens as well, an R&D site. So within our systems, we can produce approximately 50 tonnes of barramundi per annum out of a quarter-acre block, a suburban block. It is quite a small land footprint, and we're focused on. We've got quite a low energy usage in that footprint as well. We use a lot of passive flow and passive treatment, so to keep the energy down. So and when you grow fish in this way, what that means is we can distribute these farms just about anywhere. So we can locate these really close to markets, rather than the current state, which is 18, 19 hours drive from a farm to the Sydney seafood market, so or more in most cases.
I wanted to sneak one question in, because you did say in the run-up to this that you did a PhD on sharks, and you can talk about sharks, quote, until the audience's faces melt off. probably not good from a health and safety perspective. What are the impacts on sharks from overfishing? I know that's going to be very different worldwide, but you were talking about the UN SDGs.
Yep.
What are the impacts that we see from overfishing in particular areas?
Yeah, overfishing on sharks. Have we got another hour or so? So overfishing on sharks is a massive problem. So they're the second most threatened group of vertebrates in the world in terms of extinction, only behind amphibians, sharks and rays, that is, because they're closely related. The reason they're so threatened is it's to do with their biology, their life history. So they grow slowly, they mature late, and they have very few offspring. And that's a really good adaptation when you live in a natural system that doesn't have fishing, because you're basically giving birth to predators from day one, and their survivorship's really high. So they put in place, extra energy in order to have high survivorship of fewer young. Compared to bony fish, teleosts, who broadcast spawn and put millions of eggs into the water. There's a really low survivorship of those animals, but you're putting millions of eggs out at a time, so you kind of scattergunning your ability to produce adults. So in a fishery, you can hit those animals, the sharks and rays, that is, really hard, really early, and it takes them a long time to recover. So as far as overfishing goes, it's their number one threat to their extinction vulnerability. So it's massive. The way you can reduce it is, again, increase your information in the fishery, gear modifications, and just management that's based around your slowest growing species. Because when you adapt your fishery to the most vulnerable species, the things above that have a better ability to maintain their populations as well. So that's one method you can do to reduce pressure on sharks and rays.
Now, Sharon, I'm guessing we don't have Tim Jarvis in the room yet. So I will keep going with another couple of questions from the audience. There's one from the gentleman here and one from Marina. Just on the aisle. Well done. Thanks.
How much oversight is there for fisheries that have become MSC certified? So are you have you any control mechanisms after the certification is done?
Yeah, good question. It's pretty high. So that's another difference that's another sort of difference maker of the MSc program. Once you're certified, it's not like you have this certificate and then that's it, you're good. The assessment team that has independently audited that fishery meets every year, and they assess that fishery's performance against the same criteria. And then at every 5 years, you go through the same full reassessment process. So you have to demonstrate every year pretty much that you're still meeting best practice. It's also, once you're certified, you can get what's called a condition, where if some aspect of your fishery's performance isn't at global best practice, you need to demonstrate as you're certified that you are improving that area of performance which may be lagging. So that has to be closed within 5 years. So the premise is that it's an improvement model, not only for fisheries that go after certification, but once they're certified, they still have to maintain that level, and they still have to keep improving to maintain if they want to be recertified again.
And there's a question here for Marina. Yes.
That on? Yeah. Well, I was just wondering how you police are able to police all the quote-unquote sustainable fisheries. And also, I'd like to remind everyone that more than enough protein in plants. You can survive very easily, and we can actually indeed feed the world just on plants.
Yeah, cool. I'll take that one. On that last point, I agree to some extent, but it's definitely more a Western-focused ability. Like, I've been in the Pacific Islands before, where the supply ship for Rarotonga in the Cook Islands couldn't make it to land for 3 days because the weather was too rough. So they couldn't resupply the main food source that was outside of fishing for the island. And so there's like a thing of broccoli for $13 that's mouldy and sitting in the shop as basically the only piece of fresh fruit and vegetable left to eat. That's expensive, and it's mouldy and old, it's gross. So the only thing they could have eaten outside of their supplies of fish was frozen vegetables, which aren't all that nutritious. So the you can have enough protein in your diet from plants, that's fine. But I think on a global perspective, it doesn't work across all countries, and especially in developing countries, and especially in countries that rely on seafood as their main protein source. As to policing, there's two aspects to that. The MSC system itself requires that the auditing team check that fisheries performance, like I said, every year. So the fisheries client, the assessment team, and any stakeholder, any person in this room could email that, be part of that fishery, go into that room with that assessment team, with that fishery, and listen to what they're talking about. Read every part of that fisheries performance online. So it's completely transparent. There's nothing hidden. So if you want to do that, you're welcome to. And as far as policing on the water goes, that's mainly through the regulatory management agency that looks after that fishery. So, for example, New South Wales state fisheries or the Commonwealth fisheries have monitoring, control and surveillance officers. They're out in the water checking compliance to management regulations such as total allowable catches, bycatch retention and marine protected areas, making sure that those things aren't exceeding limits or fishing in places you can't. Again, that level of performance, Australia's got really good fisheries regulation, so our national waters are very well monitored in terms of that. And again, it's one of the things that the MSC that's a fundamental part of it, that you have the ability to check what's on the water, and you can verify that what you're saying and what your information, your fishery is, checks out against that regulatory framework.
Would you join me in giving a big round of applause to Matt and Adrian?
Thanks for tuning in. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Ocean Ideas. Please make sure to share it with your networks and help us in our mission to turn ripples of action into waves of change for our blue planet.